tao mà nó sẽ tao.
In commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Railways Act coming into effect, we take a look at the four resultant companies that emerged to define the future of the British National Network, creating during their short tenures many of the most iconic structures, locomotives, liveries and rolling stock that came to illustrate an era of lavish travel and luxurious prestige that continues to pervade through pop culture even to this day, starting with the oldest of the famous Big Four, the Great Western Railway, that had been formed nearly a century earlier in 1833, and was created due to demands by the merchants of the harbour city of Bristol, following the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1825 as the first railway system in the world, to provide them with better connections to London, so as to improve the speed and capacity of their goods and passenger transfer between the capital and ocean-going vessels serving the British Empire. The Bristol Chamber of Commerce, the Merchant Adventurers, and other local industrial bodies, forming a committee in 1833, that discussed an ambitious proposal for the laying of a brand new mainline railway to London, gathering up the necessary funds and seeking the services of an engineer who would design this new system. One of the applicants was Isambard Kingdom Brunel, a young engineer who had proven his worth by helping to design and build the Thames pedestrian tunnel between Rotherhithe and Wapping, and had been appointed chief engineer of the upcoming Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol, his excellent resume ultimately seeing him appointed as engineer-in-chief on what was initially dubbed the Bristol and London Railway in March 1833, though during the same year this was renamed to the Great Western Railway, Brunel, within a month of him taking up the role, being able to consider a route from London to Bristol that followed the most gentle gradients between the two cities, travelling via Reading, Swindon, Chippenham and Bath, over a course of 118 miles, the directors of the Great Western approving Brunel's scheme, and ultimately began the work of surveying the course of the line, in preparation for presenting the scheme to Parliament so as to allow for the passing of a necessary bill, a prospectus of the railway, together with a map, being drafted, and its chief aim being declared to be for the transport of goods. Initially, the bill for the construction of the railway, while passed in the House of Commons, was rejected by the House of Lords, primarily due to objections by the established gentry, whose land the railway would bisect, while the prestigious Eton College declared that the provision of a railway would tempt its students to visit the brothels of London, although a subsequent bill, despite facing severe opposition from the Lords, was ultimately passed and gained royal assent, with work on constructing the route beginning immediately, with manual labour as to excavating the gradients, cuttings and tunnels being contracted to navvies who had previous experience in digging canals, thus allowing them to find the most efficient solutions when cutting through rocks and soil, with all work in creating the railway, in a time long before steam shovels or mechanical excavators, being done by hand, obstacles such as the Brent Valley and the River Thames at Maidenhead being crossed by magnificent and sturdy viaducts, while in the few locations where the topography precluded either diverting around or climbing over hills, deep cuttings were employed, such as the 60-foot deep 2-mile-long Sonning cutting between Twyford and Reading, and tunnels such as Box Tunnel between Bath and Chippenham. Public opening of the Great Western Railway from a temporary terminus at Paddington to Taplow on the eastern bank of the Thames due to Maidenhead Viaduct having not been completed, took place on June 4, 1838, with dedicated broad-gauge locomotives Vulcan and North Star being employed as the first motive power for the line. The inaugural public train comprising 3 first-class and 5 second-class coaches, completing the 23-mile journey to Taplow in 1 hour and 20 minutes, while conveying 1,479 people and collecting £226 in revenue. The successful opening of this section of the line, despite early drawbacks regarding the comfort of the stagecoach-based carriages and rough-riding track, leading rapidly to the Great Western's incredible expansion throughout the 1800s that saw it amalgamate dozens of individual railway companies across the west of England, the Midlands and South Wales, creating a market based on a mixture of high-speed passenger services between London, Reading, Bath, Bristol, Cardiff, Swansea, Exeter, Plymouth, Penzance, Leamington, Birmingham, Shrewsbury, Chester and Birkenhead, but also vital freight corridors that conveyed manufactured goods, steel and imported produce from ships docked in Plymouth and Bristol, and, most importantly of all, coal being mined from the shafts of the South Wales valleys, which, due to its quality, was also the main fuel source for the Great Western's expansive fleet of steam locomotives. By 1900, the Great Western was one of the most important and prestigious railways in the world, renowned for its innovation, engineering prowess, and the prestige of its many iconic named trains, although the standing of the Great Western, as per its rivals and contemporaries, came to a sudden stop when World War I was declared in 1914, with the government, by an order in council, assuming supreme control of all 120 railway companies in the United Kingdom upon the start of the conflict, and while passenger timetables saw little change, the Great Western provided transport for 90% of the UK's coal supply that was employed by the Royal Navy in order to power its mighty battleships and dreadnoughts. Naval supplies of coal being given the highest priority on the railway, and were subsequently dubbed the Jellicoe Specials, in reference to John Jellicoe, 1st Earl Jellicoe and commander of the British Grand Fleet. The Navy, throughout the war, consuming nearly 6 million tons of coal, which, in addition to the domestic supply needed for regular industry to provide munitions and other equipment for the Western Front, heavily overburdened a company that had been stripped largely of the young men who kept the Great Western functioning, with 25,000 employees being called up to the front line, of which 2,525 would be killed in action. With the war came increased costs, and in order to offset this, the company was forced to push up train fares by 75%, with equal rises for goods and mineral traffic. Welsh coal, the essence of the Great Western for its day-to-day running, averaging 25 shillings and 10 pence, or £1.29 per tonne by 1918, against 14 shillings and 4 pence, or 72 pence per tonne in 1913, with the Great Western cumulatively burning 3.5 tonnes per minute every day, wages rising to meet the increased cost of living, with Great Western chairman Victor Spencer, 1st Viscount Churchill, agreeing to a bonus of 33 shillings or £1.65 to meet post-war prices, although the threat of the wartime government introducing a 40 shilling or £2 minimum wage for railwaymen, compared to their current 51 shilling or £2.65 wage, was met with hostility, and the railwaymen's unions launched a strike from September 26 to October 2, 1919, halting Parliament's planned wage cuts. In the immediate aftermath of the war's end, the issue of returning the railways to their original owners was one long debated by the government, with many voices within its ranks considering that the state should retain overall control and run the system in a manner similar to the later British Railways of 1948, although in the end, an agreement was reached in which the railway companies would be returned to private operation, but required that the original management regroup themselves into just 4 regions, creating the Big Four railway companies of the 1921 Railways Act that came into effect on January 1, 1923. And although many famous names in the UK railway scene were lost, including the Great Northern and the Caledonian Railways, the Great Western was able to retain its original 1833 moniker, while the amalgamation of companies led to the firm's track mileage, including sidings, jump by an additional 3,365 miles, although in geographical terms, the Great Western, through its aggressive expansion during the 1800s and early 1900s, meant the boundaries of the company's extent changed very little from the pre-grouping era, already hosting a main line south to Plymouth and Penzance and north to Birmingham and Chester, with the biggest changes being made through the huge expansion of the company in South Wales, as many individual mining routes were brought under the Great Western's influence, the capital of the company being augmented by around £36 million, its locomotive fleet increasing by 700 units, and 18,000 new employees were enrolled. One important effect of the railway grouping was that it made the Great Western the largest dock-owning company in the world, controlling the docks at Cardiff, Swansea, Newport, Barry, Penarth, and Port Talbot, which cumulatively handled approximately 50 million tons of goods a year, 3/4 of which was coal, while the remainder comprised nearly every other commodity exported or imported by Great Britain, the chief exports from Great Western docks being coal, patent fuel, manufactured steel, petroleum, and motor spirit, while imports comprised pig iron, timber, flour, fruit, fish, vegetables, dairy produce, live cattle, chilled meat, and general merchandise. Cooperation with the traders who helped to secure more economical and efficient transport of coal, meaning the Great Western was able to successfully initiate, in 1924, the adoption of a 20-ton wagon as the new standard for the conveyance of shipments of coal in South Wales. This new wagon replacing numerous 10 and 12-ton wagons to haul larger supplies of coal with equivalent numbers, and were introduced on both export services and domestic supply runs. Aside from coal traffic, suburban services into London Paddington were also a major income for the Great Western during the early 1900s, in which the company operated its own mainline services to Western London, Reading, Oxford, Newbury, Aylesford and Banbury, but also had something of an influence through various alliances over the years with suburban underground lines that had begun to emerge towards the end of the previous century, with the Great Western even briefly operating the pioneering Metropolitan Subsurface Railway for 6 months, and from 1920, the firm opened a new stretch of suburban line from Ealing to Shepherd's Bush, connecting to the Central London Railway's Underground line to Liverpool Street in the historic City of London, while on the main line network itself, in order to meet the demands of ever-increasing train lengths and operational speeds, newly appointed Chief Mechanical Engineer of the company, Charles Benjamin Collett, penned the new 4-cylinder 460 Castle class of engine that rapidly became the superb workhorse of the Great Western's high-speed express services between London, Bristol, South Wales, Birmingham and the South West. These machines, in their sublime pre-war Brunswick green livery, being described by engine crews as the Rolls-Royce of the permanent way. The mid-1920s, however, illustrated a new series of problems for the Great Western, starting on May 3, 1926, with the calling of a general strike across the UK due to disputes between the miners and the coal pit owners that saw overwhelming disruption across the entire nation as coal supplies ran dry for both industrial and domestic uses, and in some cases even saw violence and vandalism break out, as was the case when the LNER's premier Flying Scotsman was derailed by striking miners near Newcastle on May 11th. The Great Western, in order to ensure that the workers in their own ranks didn't join the striking miners, issuing telegrams to every employee in the company, reminding them that the dispute was solely between the miners and pit owners, while posters were put up at stations asking "Whom do you serve?" The strike ultimately ending after 9 days, during which it had cost the Great Western over £4 million in lost work. During the same year, the company was made acutely aware that, while their flagship Castle class was indeed a superb locomotive, the power of these engines was still not enough to haul a heavy, long-distance non-stop passenger train in a manner that would cut as much journey time as possible, especially in consideration of the brand-new Lord Nelson class of locomotives being introduced on the rival Southern Railway. Collett, restricted by a 20-ton axle loading gauge, beginning development of a new class of enlarged high-speed passenger locomotive to replace the Castles on the fastest express trains. That, in combination with the strengthening of bridges and track work on the trunk main lines to Plymouth, Chester, Bristol and South Wales, would lead ultimately to the unveiling of the King class during 1927, among the finest locomotives ever produced during the era of the Big Four, and one that, while somewhat restricted as to the routes it could serve, was easily able to haul 100-mile-an-hour top-line expresses out of London Paddington, and soon established itself as the power behind such venerable named trains as the Cornish Riviera, the Torbay Express, and the Bristolian. The celebratory mood of the King's entry into service didn't last long, though, as even though the Great Western had been able to survive the 1926 general strike without too much damage, continued strikes, together with rising prices and competition from road hauliers, meant by the time the Wall Street crash occurred in 1929, leading to the Great Depression of the 1930s, this unprecedented downturn hit the Great Western in a devastating way, with its dockyard assets being most affected by the severe downturn in trading, while the mines and ironworks of South Wales suffered immensely as demand for their products collapsed, leaving the Great Western no choice but to implement harsh layoffs that, alongside other redundancies within the wider industry, meant 36% of the working population in South Wales was left unemployed. In the face of spiralling coal costs, the Great Western noted the potential for diesel traction to replace steam on certain aspects of the company's operation so as to reduce its dependency on coal, and thus in December 1933 introduced the first diesel railcars ever employed on the British network in the form of the Great Western Railcars, as produced by Park Royal Vehicles, the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Works, and the Great Western's own Swindon Works. These Art Deco units comprising a single coach with streamlined front ends that were powered by 121 horsepower AEC straight-six engines, pushing these cars up to a top speed of between 63 and 80 miles an hour, while being able to convey up to 60 passengers, these trains being incredibly popular among passengers as they came complete with a buffet and toilet, and could be found on all manner of services ranging from commuter use on lines such as the Windsor branch, but also on intercity runs between Birmingham Snow Hill and Cardiff General. By the dawn of 1935, while the Great Western became the first British railway company in history to celebrate 100 years of operation, the festivities were dampened by the firm's continued reeling in the wake of the downturn caused by the Great Depression, with much of the ground lost on the coal market and other goods traffic struggling to be regained as the recession lingered throughout the decade and left demand at rock bottom. The King class, as the flagships of the fleet, were still capable and powerful engines that worked a majority of the Great Western's top expresses, but by the end of the 1930s were starting to be sidelined in the public consciousness as more flamboyant and Art Deco streamlined engines came to steal the limelight. The Gresley A4 Pacifics of the LNER and the LMS's Coronation Pacifics being so much more faster and ostentatious in their styling that they soon became living legends of the railways, while efforts to streamline the Kings for purely aesthetic purposes never went beyond a few experiments, the Great Western appearing to have settled into an image of purposeful but utilitarian-looking locomotives and coaching stock that did their job well, but didn't encompass the same panache that was desired by the travelling public of the time. All this, however, was swept away with the declaration of World War II in 1939, as unlike World War I, which didn't truly affect the British homeland with the exception of a few raids by Zeppelin airships, the possibility of widespread aerial bombardment, as illustrated during the Spanish Civil War of 1936, meant that instead of supplying coal for the Navy, the company had to provide evacuation trains taking children from the inner city of London to the safety of the West Country. Ealing Broadway, the main station for women and children leaving their homes in the capital, handling 163 trains carrying 112,994 evacuees in just 4 days, while in 1940, air raids began in earnest as the Luftwaffe of Nazi Germany targeted British cities and infrastructure in order to cripple the war effort and destroy morale among the people. Stations including Bristol, Birmingham, Birkenhead and Plymouth all taking serious bomb damage, while the docks at Swansea in South Wales also suffered near constant assault from above. These problems compounded by a severe accident on November 4, 1940, when due to a mixture of driver error and poorly placed signalling, an overnight express hauled by King-class locomotive 6208 King George VI jumped the tracks when traversing pointwork too fast and caused a major pile-up that killed 27 people. Come the end of the war in 1945, the Great Western, much like the rest of the network, was a tattered and under-maintained shadow of its former self, with trackwork, stations, locomotives and other infrastructure all showing significant neglect, while at the same time having to deal with severe bomb damage that had been patched over with temporary fixes in order to keep services operational, the Big Four railway companies essentially having been dissolved already, as much like World War I, the British state had requisitioned each of the firms for use in supplying the war effort. Although unlike the situation faced by each of the companies during the 1921 Railways Act, the newly appointed Labour government of Clement Attlee, as part of their overarching swathe of nationalisation across UK industry, opted to retain ownership of the UK rail network as part of the 1947 Transport Act, in which the former assets of the Great Western, the Southern, the LMS and the LNER would be absorbed into a newly formed state-owned rail operator called British Railways, which came into effect from January 1, 1948. British Railways, at the time of its formation, incorporating from the former Great Western Railway 9,244 miles of track, 3,857 steam locomotives, 37 diesel locomotives, 8,368 coaches, 87,403 wagons, 16 harbours and dockyards, 9 steamboats, 5 hotels, 3,831 houses and cottages, and 113,601 employees. With the Great Western having been wrapped up 115 years after its formation in 1833, its former empire was allocated as part of British Railways into what was dubbed the Western Region. But even with the change in ownership, management figures within the Western Region, which comprised almost entirely ex-GWR executives and directors, continued to keep alive the notion that they were still the autonomous Great Western Railway, and therefore undertook their operations and practices in a manner that almost always defied their instructions from the wider British Railways management, exemplified during the late 1950s and early 1960s, where the Western Region opted to take on diesel hydraulic traction as a means of replacing steam, rather than the more conventional diesel-electric transmission adopted by other BR regions, while at the same time being one of 2 regions to introduce the 6 to 8 car Blue Pullman sets that ran ultra-luxury services between London Paddington, Bristol, Cardiff and Wolverhampton. Eventually, following the wasteful expenditure of the ultimately fruitless modernisation plan of 1955, the 1960s saw BR's management crack down on the autonomy of the individual regions, and the Western Region was eventually dragged into line as standardisation became the order of the day, the diesel hydraulics being swept away by diesel-electric power, while in order to cut as many losses as possible, the once massive trackwork of the Great Western was pruned heavily under the recommendations of the Beeching Report, which not only saw dozens of rural branch lines severed, but also brought about the end of many mainline corridors, including the Great Western's route to Birmingham, Wolverhampton, Shrewsbury, Chester and Birkenhead. With the line beyond Birmingham being severed in 1972, the joint Great Western London North Western station at Birkenhead Woodside being closed, and the line south of Birmingham through Leamington and Banbury being redirected to London Marylebone instead. It wouldn't be until the mid-1970s, though, that the Western Region would see a resurgence in its prestige through consolidation of its remaining assets and the introduction of new motive power to help improve speed and comfort in a manner not seen since before World War II. The 1976 arrival of the high-speed train, or HST sets, being a watershed moment for the route, as with their 125-mile-an-hour performance, these diesel express trains were able to turn the major regional centres of Reading, Didcot, Oxford, Swindon, Bath, Bristol and Cardiff into major commuter hubs for London workers that saw a surge in new house building and a rapid spike in property prices, the legacy of the HSTs in revitalizing operations upon the former Great Western Main Line being handed down through successive generations of high-speed trains, with the mantle now held by the Class 800 and Class 802 bi-mode and electric units that replaced the HSTs on long-distance trains during 2019, while partial electrification of the route has helped to improve the efficiency of many trunk services to South Wales and the Thames Valley, the continuing legacy of the original creators of this vital corridor to the west of London being reflected in a 2015 rebranding of the incumbent train company into a livery and mark that harkened back to the golden era of the line, by reviving the name that started it all 190 years ago, the Great Western Railway.